Welcome back to another webinar as part of the Proper Good series that we're doing. My name's Nicola. I'm one of the founding directors of an organisation called Flourish Together. We're a pay-it-forward consultancy and support lots of different kinds of social entrepreneurs, social enterprises, social businesses, charities, projects, you name it. Really pleased to have been asked back by Sector 3 to create another series of webinars to build on their Inspire to Enterprise sessions that we did. Details of those will be in the notes for you to refer back to online and get involved in some of those sessions. This session today is all about income generation strategies and including accessing support. It builds on a business planning and business model canvas session that we run in part 1. And then we've got an impact measurement and communicating your impact and value session in part 3. So I hope that you find this useful, and it's a good either introduction or refresher and reminder on how do social enterprises make their money and income, and how do you make it all stack up and work well so that you can be sustainable. So we'll get started. So income generation cocktails, I call them. Multiple ways to make money as a social enterprise or generate resources in order to run what you're doing, operate your activities, services, programs, venture as a whole. And there's more than one way, as you'll see here, to generate that income and make sure that you've, I guess, got a cocktail together that works for you in terms of what you're trying to run, what you understand, where you're best placed to raise resources and income for what you do. So clearly here, there's a number of ways of doing it, and we're going to walk through what these all mean and also talk about where you might access support, think about how legal structure preferences sort of affect some of this stuff as well. But let's start with trading, because that's one of the most straightforward terms that people understand. So trading is ultimately selling products and services. Lots of social enterprises sell products and services. When you first got an idea and you first get going, if you've come from a lived experience perspective, or if you've come from tackling a social need and you've started from a voluntary sort of angle and you're just trying to meet a need, profit and trading and some of this stuff might seem like a bit of a dirty word, or you're not quite sure where to start with it. That's fine, and that can evolve over time. If I share with you some examples here, you'll soon get the gist, and hopefully think about your own organisations and the way that you might look at developing a trading income for what you're doing. Anybody listening here, there's a good chance that within this, I'll just step back, within these boxes, you'll know what you're doing in some boxes and not what you're doing in others. And you'll have ideas for what you're going to do, or you'll have track record for what you've already tried and been successful at or not so far. And so we're just looking at these and thinking through different options for where, what's going to be helpful for you. So in terms of trading, these are all social enterprise ideas. So there's an organisation called Cowherds. They originally started in Salford. They started as a sort of pop-up cafe and cafe selling all sorts of fresh juices, sort of vegan food and snacks. And over time, they evolved their organisation into becoming a fresh smoothie and drinks provider, and fantastic organisation. Clearly, they sell smoothies and juices. They've done that out of their own sort of cafes and premises previously, but they've also gone and branched into producing these to other places. So different cafes and bars and restaurants can buy the various juices, and they then create their surpluses to reinvest in other community activities, promoting health, well-being, helping people that might not always have the access to such fresh and nutritious fruits and smoothies to get access to their products. And so there's an example of how, started off as a cafe, but actually evolved into trading, the specific product, when they learned about where their skills best align, where the market best suited what they were trying to do, and where they'd have the most impact. So that was where they're at. The next photograph along is a Hume Community Garden Centre. I don't know if anyone's come across that or visited there. Highly recommend it. Clearly, we're developing this webinar for Sector 3 in Stockport, and there were various, community allotments, growing groups and growing projects. The garden centre here sells all sorts. It's selling its plants and trees and tools and all sorts of things to do with gardening and growing and horticulture. They're also selling various gifts and ethical products in the shop there. There's a cafe that is run by another social enterprise, Cafe Sorrel, that sells coffee and tea and cakes and catering and all sorts. And you've got another thing that they're trading is room hire. So they're trading in event space. People can hire gazebos and a marquee and a training room and, outdoor areas for their events and things that they might want to run. So various things that the garden centre there are trading in. And then they're reinvesting their profits in supporting their volunteer programmes, supporting training and learning stuff, supporting their sustainability and environmental agendas. So that's something that they're doing. This cafe, it's not currently running, but it's a good example of a social enterprise cafe. This was set up by the Clink. There was a cafe in the middle of Manchester, and the Clink restaurant over at Style Prison, still there, and loads of examples in Stockport and surrounding area of social enterprise cafes where people are getting their tea, their coffee, their sandwiches. Ultimately they're trading. It's a retail space for trading food, drinks, and cakes and whatever else. Often they might be selling more sort of ethical drinks and snacks and so on. In this case, as with lots of other social enterprise cafes that run, there's perhaps a particular target audience, a particular set of beneficiaries that they're trying to upskill and help get back into the workplace. In the case of the Clink restaurants and cafes like it, they're supporting people who come into contact with the criminal justice system and ex-offenders to get skills and get working. There are other cafes around supporting people perhaps who've had mental health issues. You've got your Oasis cafe at Stepping Hill over in Stockport. There are other cafes and catering services popping up to do with different cultural skills, backgrounds and foods to bring to the world. So trading food goods basically and various other things is often what they're doing. I've got an example of an app here. There are apps that sell all sorts, help broker the sales of all sorts. So the Too Good To Go app, it was developed down south, but it's actually by somebody at university at the time. And it's now national, and you go on that app and you buy food. It's food that would otherwise have perhaps gone to waste, surplus stock that day that hasn't sold at full price. So at a certain point in the day, cut price goods, takeaway foods, and boxed dinners, sandwiches, you name it, gets put on the app. And if you're in a certain area and there's all this stuff there, instead of some of the other mainstream sites where you might buy a takeaway or order your tea or whatever, or your lunch for the next day, you can go on here and get really, as it says, food from as little as £2 from some lovely food from restaurants, cafes and bakeries that would otherwise have gone to landfill. So they're selling food, but in a different way. They're brokering surplus food and saving the planet at the same time. I wanted to put in an example locally. It's new news. I think It's Her Story are one of the first proper good investees, and I thought it was a great example of trading. It's Her Story do all sorts of media and communications work with different groups and help build skills and confidence in people to set up their own ventures, to get back to work. But they're setting up their own trading arm, and it'll be a marketplace for, merchandise and selling and supporting women to design and create goods that can then be sold. So again, an example of an organization that perhaps didn't set up with a huge trading arm of, as a retail outlet, but is now evolving their own version of this alongside other grant-funded work, commission services, and other things. So that's one example. And this lady here is a lady called Vic Turnbull, whether anyone's come across her. I'm sure she'll be linking in with some of the proper good work. She runs an organisation called Mike Media, and it's all about creating awesome audio and upskilling people to design and record and share podcasts and different kinds of media, audio media that helps whoever, community groups, startups, and anyone else, larger organisations, to develop great content and be skilled to do so. And she does the podcast editing and producing and trains people. So she's selling her time. And I put that in as an example that people are always trading in, nuts and bolts or biscuits and smoothies. They're trading themselves, and Vic's out there selling herself, so to speak, where people are buying her expertise, consultancy services, and training courses and events. And I've also included in here Me Again. They're not based in Greater Manchester, they're over on the Wirral, but a really interesting example of somebody's journey where they're running a social enterprise linked to trading and are trading all sorts. So the lady that set this up was a hairdresser and beautician by trade, and that's what she ran. She got her own salon and a staff team, doing people's hair, doing their beauty and everything else. And she realised throughout her career that there were a lot of the customers that were being affected by cancer, and their self-esteem was being affected. Clearly, they couldn't have a haircut, or not in the ways that they'd imagined or had done previously. And so Me Again went down 2 or 3-fold route. They started running all sorts of coffee mornings and drop-ins and sessions to help women talk about what was going on, come to terms with what was going on for them in their lives, and starting to learn how to feel more like themselves again when diagnosed with, living with, or recovering from cancer. And what they also do, on the sales side, is they sell wigs as well. So being a hairdresser, they got into selling wigs and also selling beauty therapy treatments that were aligned to supporting people affected by cancer. In addition to running the hairdressing salon, so the sort of two things ran separately but were working in tandem. And Me Again, in addition to selling the wigs direct to people, as we'll talk about commissioning in a minute, they also got quite large-scale commission contracts to help people who couldn't afford to buy wigs to get access to wigs and access to support and other stuff. So just some examples there of trading. If you've not thought about what you could sell, have a think about it. It's either very clear from the outset and you're a trading business from the off, for example, like HM Pasties, busy selling pasties, and then behind the scenes, they're upskilling people who've come through the criminal justice system. So they were a trade first to then create the space, the facilities, and then the resources to change hearts and minds, and also work with people to get them into work and opportunities. Or you've got other people who, started off with something voluntary or something freelance or something that was addressing social need first, and then looked at how to create products and services further down the line. So there's no right or wrong way to start with thinking about trading, but costing things out appropriately and not going all out trading something if you've not thought through what it's going to cost you, because you could send yourself bankrupt before you get started if you've not thought it through. So that's one caveat, but trading is often something that people could do, but you might be trading in something that's a little bit different to what you imagined, or a little bit different to what you set out with originally. So that's trading. Commissioning, it's like, what is commissioning? Commissioning is almost like a wholesale version of trading. So trading, you probably trade directly with the public. There might be, business to consumer trading or business to business trading is often what happens. With commissioning, it's like almost like a bulk buying of goods and services, and commissioners will have budgets to achieve certain goals. So there's public sector commissioners. They might be in health and social care. They might be in education and skills and employability. They might be commissioners trying to improve the criminal justice system, commissioners that are trying to improve the environment or reduce the amount of emissions and carbon that we're using, all sorts of commissioners out there. There might be local authority commissioners looking at a particular patch, and they've got set goals to try and achieve to reduce inequalities or upskill people or improve the way of the world. And by going to commissioners, it's a much larger scale that you're going to have to deliver services on, perhaps, depending on what you're going for. There are also, we mustn't forget, voluntary community sector commissioners. So, people can commission pieces of work, programs, things that dovetail in with what they're doing. So commissioning can be used to create collaborations. Commissioning can be used for research and development. If a commissioner's not ready to, put a contract out for you to bid for yet, they might have slightly smaller contracts where they'll commission you to do something, to test you out, and to pilot an idea, do something that might have a little bit of risk attached. Either they don't know you, not sure what the outcome is going to be, or you're all trying to create a new solution to something. There are small scale, 2K, 5K, 10K commissioned pieces of work that often the voluntary community sector and even early stage ones can get in and work through in order to build a reputation with commissioners to bid for larger scale work, either directly with that commissioner or through some of these procurement portals, are called, or commissioning portals, where large-scale contracts are put out and you bid for why you should be the person to deliver that. And they are somewhat long-winded. There is a lot more red tape around large-scale sort of procurement and commissioning, and you have to have certain things in place and a certain track record, and you have to be signed up to certain portals like these in order to be eligible, to be ready, and to go for those opportunities. But knowing that they exist helps you think about the long term. And as I've said, I commission work, I commission people to do short projects, as do lots of other voluntary community organisations. So there are stepping stones in to doing this stuff. And ultimately, you really need to understand what's the commissioner's needs and priorities. What are they wanting? You can't just swan in and say, we want to do this, commission us to do this, because that's not how it works. Or we have all of this stuff, you should be buying it. Again, that's not how it works. You need to be researching and building relationships with, who's got power and influence and budget and need, and thinking about what are their priorities, what do their strategy documents and policy reports say about what they're trying to achieve for the next 3 to 5 years, and how do your services, your solutions, your products address their needs. And that's your best route into thinking about relationships with people that could commission your services, whether they're local authorities, sector-based, or some other means. They're going to want to know that you've got a track record. It's unlikely that people will commission you when you've only been running a year or so. These things take time to build. They need to see that there's an evidence base for what you're doing, both in terms of impact, reputation, and what's going on. So often you'll need to have networked with different people so that people understand who you are and what you do. As I said, there's a bit more red tape around this. There can be commissioning processes involved. These might be bespoke commissions or tenders that get put out to the public, and then you respond to an invitation to tender, or through a tender that's out on a public platform for you to respond to. Sometimes they'll want match money or match resources. Sometimes they've just got a budget. They need these outcomes to be delivered to some degree, and they're giving you the flexibility to come up with a proposal for how you would do that, creating the most value for money for them, and ideally the most social impact, which is what we as social ventures bring to the table. And usually you'll have some sort of service level agreement or grant agreement or contract agreement, and they'll want to see all sorts of policies that you have in place to mitigate any risks, and so they know that you're operating effectively and appropriately, and they'll want to make sure you've got certain levels of insurance in place as well. They really, they're going to need to know that you've got the capacity to deliver what you're proposing, you've got the capacity to monitor and report back to them on what's going on. That can be the killer in some of this stuff. If you're not used to monitoring and evaluating what you do, perhaps you don't have a very large admin team, sometimes that's where smaller or startup social ventures can come a cropper, or they just wouldn't, fulfill certain requirements of certain commissioning opportunities. So something to bear in mind, that it's a slightly different way of working. Often with going for commissioned work, you've got to be really careful and make sure that the budget or the tender price that you're going for is something that you can actually deliver that piece of work for. You need to ensure as an organisation that you'll get full cost recovery in what you're doing. It might be that you have to put an element of match overhead in, or it might be when you read between the lines and start to look at what it's going to take to deliver this project, actually it's going to cost you a good £5,000 more than they're offering. And so it might be something you need to step away from. Or more often than not, they don't put the budget price on, so it's a bit of guesswork. They vary. If they're on a portal, there's a good chance they'll give you a ballpark figure. If it's commissioners from your local authorities and areas, having a chat with them and thinking through what's the budget that you're working to, really does help you plan what you're going to do, how you're going to design your proposal, or indeed if you're going to take a step back from that opportunity because it's not appropriate for you at that time. They might want to see certain legal structures, and certainly they'll want to see good governance. I would say there is, within certain local authorities, within certain ways of commission work, they're interested to see, or they might have policies to suggest that they're going to try to work with social enterprises or people that are giving back to the local community, that social value might be equally as high as cost value in the providers that they seek to find. But I'd say we're still a little way to go before social enterprises get prioritised over others for all tender and contract opportunities that go out. Ultimately, it'll come down to what extent your reputation precedes you, the partners that you work with, and whether or not you've got a strategic fit and have got the right skills and can work to the brief that's being set out. So there's portals out there that they're worth signing up to, and you can tick lots of boxes to get notifications as to what contract opportunities are out there. That there are also other spaces and places that might link specifically to a sector. So, for example, the Arts Council, if you're working in arts and community, they have this portal that you can sign up to if you're working in that world. They actually have a really good commissioning toolkit as well that's worth a little look. I've left a link to. There's another, creativefuture.org. They've got a commissioning pack. That's actually an overview of commissioning that's for the south of England. And you'll see, if you look at that, it's all about the south. However, it's structured and the information is transferable to every region of the country. So if you were to go onto that website and have a look at it, everything that's in there is directly relatable. They talk about developing relationships with a local economic partnership, the LEPs. They talk about how to prepare to reach out and work with commissioners. It's a good toolkit, but it's not place-based for the north of England, unfortunately. But I like the way it's structured and it gives really good information, so I've left it in. And then, interestingly as well, and we'll come back to this in the next webinar about impact measurement, but Nesta have created an interesting resource that talks about standards and talks about how to help yourself get ahead when it comes to commissioning. And some commissioners will want to see that you've got certain standards and certain evidence and impact gathering in place, as will certain funders, to be fair, before they back you, before they'll work with you. And so if that's something you've not thought about too much yet, it might be worth having a look at that toolkit of nesters around creating your evidence base and looking at standards that commissioners and others might look for when they're seeking to see whether you're at the right stage of development, the right stage of operations to be able to work with. So I put that in there for your thinking. Some of you might be looking at commissioning already. Some of you might be developing relationships with local authorities, health and social care, education and learning and training organisations, and some of you might be, working to tender opportunities already. But it's a completely different beast to trading with a direct public. But as I say, if particularly in the social economy, it's something that people work towards within 2 or 3 to 5 years, and it's a kind of wholesale way of operating as opposed to dealing with a direct sort of public or direct sort of businesses. So we've looked at trading and commissioning. There are other ways of raising resources, and certainly as part of the Proper Good programme, funding and social investment is part of the piece, and we'll come back to that in a second. I was just going to look at fundraising types. So as much as you can go for funding, so I'm just going to pop back here. So funding, some of you will know because you'll be looking at it. Funding is, there's forms, there's an eligibility criteria, there's a fund somewhere, somebody's got a pot of public money, usually, charitable money, public money, local neighbourhood grant money, all sorts of funding out there. And you have to look at the criteria, you decide whether it's something you want to go for. Are you eligible? How long is the window for this application deadline? When would you get a decision by? All of these things are really important to know as to whether or not you're going to bother to make the time. Because what I will say is it's great to be able to get funding to help you build, research and development options, help subsidise the cost of things, help at startup stage and other times in the running and development of your organisation. Certainly not something to become reliant on. You can't become reliant on it. It's just not sustainable. And it's at risk. You could spend 3 days of your life writing a funding bid. You could spend 3 weeks of your life writing a funding bid that may come to nothing. Whereas you could spend 3 days or 3 weeks of your life selling products and services, or looking at, building relationships with commissioners who might then, give you a small piece to pilot something or build on something further down the line. What I'm saying is spending your time looking at trading and getting repeat business seems to bring much more rewards potentially than spending 3 days of your life writing funding bids. So it's just an example that you've got to weigh up which income generation routes are best for you. And even if you start off with funding because that's the best route to get started and you've not got the financial means to start up and test things out, making sure that you've got this cocktail and these different methods, you don't put all your eggs in one basket, is a key part to running a social venture. And when we look at the kind of free money side of things, so the funding and the fundraising, the distinct difference is that funding is the form, the eligibility criteria. Somebody makes a judgment, they let you know, and that you do or don't get that money, which is similar to social finance and social investment, but obviously that money you usually have to pay back. Funding are grants and money to invest in outcomes, or to invest in your work, or to invest in developing you and your team. Social finance and investment is usually either there's equity investment, a bit like Dragon's Den, and investment sort of business angels who will invest in what you're doing and want a return. Equity is one side of the coin, loan investment is the other, and usually there are all sorts of terms and conditions for those loans. Often you've had to have been refused by a bank for social investment to be able to access it, and there'll be different terms and, payment timeframes to pay that social investment back. And the Proper Good Fund has got a series of grant and loan options available to explore through the websites, like Sector 3 and through GMCVO's website we'll come back to shortly. But fundraising is the kind of less strings attached version. That's why I've got this slide wanting to just walk through it to show you the difference. So I call this a kind of unrestricted funds, more or less, free money. So it isn't free money. You have to work hard to find and get this stuff. But what I'm saying is there's less eligibility criteria, if you will, on some of this stuff. And it's more about you having a way to reach your community, to get them to buy into and back what you're doing, and the money or the resources that you raise, you can usually choose what you do with that money, as opposed to when you're being commissioned, you've got to do specifically what that commission tender says, and there's little room for negotiation. If you've gone for a fund, you've usually got to spend that money exactly what the fund is asking for, and it's hard to build flexible margins or buffers into these things. Fundraising is a way where you've got more flexibility to choose what you do with that money once you've raised it, or if indeed it is money. There's more to fundraising than cash alone. So these examples here, I'm going to talk about crowdfunding in a second. So we've got crowdfunding in there as a key example we'll come back to. Sponsorship and corporate social responsibility. This is developing relationships with maybe the private sector in the main, other individuals who might want to invest in what you're doing as a form of philanthropy, as a form of corporate social responsibility, to show that they're investing in good and the community. Or certain organisations, a bit like commissioners, might have particular areas of interest. They might be more aligned with environmental improvement, or something might have happened in their life or within their staff team or within their family background that aligns them to some sort of social cause. And it's all about building relationships to see if you can get people to back you and sponsor something specific. And it can be with corporates, it can be with partnerships with local businesses, as we've got here, partnerships for sponsorship or partnerships for other things. So partnerships with local businesses can reap all sorts of rewards. And it might be that you can get people to help you with mentoring, or come onto your board, or offer guidance and advice on something where they've been there and done that, bought the t-shirt, and you're wanting to ask their advice. They might offer you things in kind. For example, I know I've got a tale of a guy who years ago, and this was down south, he was, rather than walk in and go, we need money, he walked into a local business and said, we need some marketing advice. Could your marketing department help us with some marketing support and just give us some tips? It's a much more easy thing to say yes to than we need 500 quid, or we need £1,000, or we need whatever it might be. And from getting that bit of marketing advice, once they'd got in there, the marketing team suddenly fell in love with this local amazing community project that was, distributing food to the community in an area that had a lack of amenities. This organisation that was helping those most disadvantaged and vulnerable in society to get access to food and debt advice and support and a range of other things. And so within the space of 6 months or so, he'd gone from getting a bit of marketing advice to this organisation offering him storage space to put the surplus goods that they needed to then distribute to the community. And then, they ended up, gifting them one of their old vehicles that they no longer needed. So it's just examples of relationship building can lead to all sorts of stuff that doesn't look like money from the outset, but saves you an awful lot of money if you don't have to purchase these things or rent space or whatever it might be. Membership. So some organisations have sort of charge membership fees or subs, or weekly donations or whatever it might be. But thinking about that as an option is something, although it can take some administration. So you have to think about what you've got capacity to do. e-fundraising and social media, it kind of ties in with crowdfunding really. Two go hand in hand, and it's instead of going to Asda or wherever, there are lots of these, see my hiccups, these supermarkets or wherever where you can go and pack bags and you have your bucket and people throw them, instead of going with your tin or your bucket, you've got your bucket online basically, and you're using online information, perhaps through your website, through using Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter as a way to direct messages and communications and updates to your community or your wider network at large to request donations and support. Or you might see at Christmas, there's often community groups saying, this week, collecting different things leading up to Christmas to help their community make sure they've got what they need for Christmas, or perhaps same sort of goes for helping communities get what they need for Eid or other cultural and religious celebrations where communities can't get involved in the same way and might need some support. So asking for donations of goods is also something you can do through e-fundraising and social media as opposed to cash alone. I'm not really going to get into community shares and impact bonds too heavily on this. It's a minefield in itself, that one. But for organisations that are perhaps looking to raise large amounts of money or taking on assets or developing collaborative partnerships, at scale, then community shares and social impact bonds are things to think about or do some research into. It's probably is best to say. Community shares a little bit like a little bit like crowdfunding, but the people are buying a community share in your whatever it is, project, business, asset, and they get a return on those shares. So you can create a window where you don't have to pay anyone back anything for a period of time, a couple of years or so, but then they'll get they might get some sort of return, financial return on that, or they might be able to take their shares back after a certain period of time. There are some organisations I know of where rather than getting paid in cash, they're getting paid in beer or cake or whatever the organisation is creating. So you can set your own rules around some of this stuff, and it can unlock money in new ways. I remember working with an organisation in Levenshulme and helping set up a community share issue for them, and it was a church that was regenerating, creating housing and community event space and all sorts of services. And when they put the community share issue out, the local mosque invested £50,000 in this share issue. Obviously through Islam, they've got zakat, which is like a giving back and sort of charitable giving. And they chose to invest. This mosque chose to invest some of its surplus resources into the church up the road, which was quite an interesting tale and an unexpected benefit from putting the community share issue out. Again, it takes some administration, this stuff. So if you've not got the capacity or the headspace for admin dealing with payments and updates and keeping tabs on all of that, you might be better choosing some other routes to fundraising. Social impact bonds, different beast again, and they're developed in sort of public sector relationships where you're going to deliver a series of outcomes for public sector bodies and be paid in these impact bonds as a result. There was something that was developed a little while ago, and there's limited examples of where these things have really truly been successful, but they're still there as a vehicle and an entity, if that's relevant for people. And then things like ticketed events, amongst many other things, donations, pay as you feel, ticketed events, raffles, tombolas, marathons, you name it. There's all sorts of ways to fundraise. It's just thinking about what have you got time for? What's actually going to work with your community? What will they engage with? Do you have to do this stuff, or have you got a friends of group that will do this for you? It's just things to bear in mind. On the crowdfunding, I was going to come back to that because it's a thing in itself. And I mean, we've run workshops on this, and there are other people that help people get their heads around crowdfunding. But it's a kind of bridge between funding and investment, and it can be a really good way to test the market, build awareness and have your community be immersed and involved in what you're doing. It's a campaign in effect, to raise awareness around what you're doing and raise resources at the same time. That's traditionally the way the voluntary community and social enterprise world uses this stuff. There are more private sector facing crowdfunding sites as well that are about raising investment and looking at helping startups scale up or get started, or helping new product development. But in the voluntary community and social enterprise world, crowdfunding is a growing part of the way organizations get started and get invested in. There are all sorts of sites out there. I'm just flagging it up here to show you the context of how it's a growing source of funding for people thinking about starting or finding money from nowhere to do what they're trying to do. And alongside that sort of more private equity and sort of venture capital side of crowdfunding, these community routes do reap rewards as well. So just looking recently on the Crowdfunder UK website, over 250 million has been raised thanks to 1 million people since they got cracking, and over 300,000 ideas have been supported through that site. I vouch for that. I've run 4 successful crowdfunding campaigns through there, but I also know people who've used Space Hive and Kickstarter and other platforms as well. And then there are some of the smaller sites like Just Giving and Local Giving that are slightly more sort of charitable or project based as well. So it's a case of doing your research and having a look as to whether some of this stuff could be useful to you. But if you have a crowd to go to, I would say there's no point going to crowdfunding if people don't know who you are, you haven't already got a few hundred people that you're in contact with. There's some golden rules to crowdfunding, and so I wouldn't undertake that stuff lightly. It takes a lot of work. They tend to run over 5 to 8 weeks as a full-on intensive piece of work. It's not just pop an idea up there and people are ready to back your idea. It doesn't work like that. It's very much about sort of word of mouth, using social media. The 90% of the people who invest in your crowdfund will know you in the main, unless the crowdfund's run in a slightly different way and it's based on certain causes, or you've got celebrity endorsements, and it depends on the nature of what you're doing. But the majority of people we've worked with with crowdfunding, it's a hard slog through your existing networks to get them to buy into what you're currently asking for support for, and put their money where their mouth is in backing you, and finding creative ways to ask different kinds of partners and people that to invest in what you're doing. So something to think about, and that they're an adventure, not for the faint-hearted, but they can be really useful. And if you were to look at some of these crowdfunding websites and have a little search around, putting in keywords that relate to your project or organisation or venture, you'll see what other people have been doing, how they've presented themselves, what secured the money and what didn't, to give you a feel for how to get started. And we've certainly got podcasts and other things on top tips and ways of doing this to have a look at as well. So back to our full income generation cocktail. We've talked about all of these in the main now. We've looked at trading, so sales of products and services. Trading ultimately, is taxable, and if you're over certain tax thresholds, and you get to choose how you spend that money. So there's some freedom around that, but it's whether or not you've got it in the nature of the work that you're doing to be able to trade, whether you've got a market to trade with and to. Commissioning, it's meeting a commissioner's brief or tender opportunity. You're delivering a proposal on a set budget that you've designed together. There's quite a bit more additional reporting involved in commissioning, which you don't get with trading, so that's highlighted in there. Funding, as I said, not something to rely on, but is great for startup stuff, innovating new ideas, research and development. You can get some funders that will fund core costs, but usually it might be project based or to deliver specific outcomes, again a bit like commissioning. There are certain funds like the National Lotteries Reaching Communities and a range of other charitable trusts that might fund in 2 to 3 years core funding, but they're competitive, they're hard to get. Funding is often not treated in the same way as trading income. It might be that you're given a grant agreement as opposed to receiving payment for something, an invoice. And so grant agreements are treated as a donation in some respects. You'll still get taxed, when you're buying things, through normal tax on goods, and there's still a tax to pay on where if you've got freelancers and associates and paying national insurance and income tax and things like that, but it's not taxed as it comes in. It won't be classed as your sort of corporation tax. You speak to your accountants about that and it'll get categorized accordingly. There's often a predetermined budget, a bit like with commissioning. So you set out in your funding application what you're going to spend this money on. And whilst there's a little bit of flex in that sometimes, you really have to speak to that individual funder if there's been a real shift in what you're going to spend your money on. So funding has got to be spent on what you said it was or what you've planned for. And, you can't build profits, particularly into a funding application. It's public money. You might be able to move money around to do something unforeseen, or to, if you save money in a particular bid, then spend that money on something else. But it's to be negotiated with a funder. And just like with commissioning, there's additional reporting, and you really have to read the small print and check with a funder, what are they after? What's the admin, the paperwork, the impact and evaluation stuff? What do you have to do to get your hands on this money? Are they going to make you do some pitch? Are they going to make you travel to London? Are they going to make you join a program that's going to be a day a month out of your time? Work out whether or not that fund's the right one, and then go for it. And then fundraising, as we've just said there, it's donations. That can be cash donations. It could be other goods, services, or other in-kind support. It's usually non-taxable because it's donations. And if you're a registered charity, and I know we're talking social enterprise here, so there's not all of you will be charities. Where people are a charity, they should be able to sign up for gift aid. That GA is for gift aid, and that's an additional 20% on top of what you've raised. Will be returned back to you. And as I've said, a bit more flexible. You can choose what you spend that money on usually. And in some crowdfunding cases and in certain circumstances, and when you've talked to the public about we're fundraising for this, they expect to see you make the change in that area. They expect to see you spend the money according to what you've said you're going to do. And as I say, some crowdfund applications and sites now, particularly those asking for match funding, or that will give you match funding, should I say, want a bit more information about how you're going to spend the money, but there's flex there around what you can do. And then social finance and investment, as I said, it's loans and it's equity investment. And I would say at startup stages and early stages, it's not necessarily something you're going to go down the routes of. In order to go for social finance, social investment, you need to have some sort of track record. You need to have a kind of minimum viable product, as they call it, sort of a repeatable thing, a tried and tested service, tried and tested product that you're now seeking to grow, expand, replicate. And that's, if you've got a tried and tested business model, product, and the market there's a demand there for it, and you've evidenced that, or you can clearly show there's evidence for that, and you've got clearly costed plans for a 2, 3 to 5 year period, you're in a position where looking at these sorts of options might be right for you. And certainly knowing that the Proper Good Fund has all sorts of sort of loan options in there. There's a 0% loan as well as ones with other sort of payment terms. It's worth exploring that with the team if you think it's something that you want to make use of or explore. And then we've got details at the end of this session. So just wanted to take another step to the side and just remind people that your legal structure affects what you can and can't do and apply for. And this isn't hard and fast and set in stone this, but it's just to give you a flavour for depending on what you have set up or what you might set up in future affects certain things. So on this little spectrum here, on the one hand side, you've got the kind of private structures, and so private companies, and including sole traders, freelancer sole traders in that. There'll be more private sector-led companies limited by guarantee, companies limited by shares, and more sort of private sector-focused co-ops. If you're set up as a private business, then you're not eligible for charitable monies and philanthropic funds and the public money that's out there from a range of grant and charitable sources, because you're not a charity, or you've not got a not-for-private profit background behind what you're doing. You might be a profit for purpose organisation, but certainly funders will be looking at your governing documents, your memorandum and articles of association, your constitution, if you're an unincorporated association or charity. They'll be wanting to see and check what your mission and aims and objectives are all about, and what happens to your any surpluses, what happens to any remaining assets should you wind up. And not-for-private profit organisations clearly show how they're not-for-profit, and so that's why they're eligible for certain funds. Being a not-for-profit is not suitable for everybody. It might not be where you want to be, it might not be your sort of values base, you might not see that as something that's relevant for you, but most of the people who are looking at the proper good will tie in with the whole sort of social enterprise world and social economy, and be wanting to do good business that does good, and reinvest profits and reinvest surpluses as a force for good, force for social change, and should be eligible one way or another for certain types of funding and investment. So this little context here shows you that basically as a private entity, clearly loans and so on, not loans, sorry, grants aren't, and the philanthropic grants aren't an option, but lots of other things are, as you'll see there. And often when you're looking at equity investment or loan investment, the more of a sort of sustainable business model you've got to be able to pay that investor back, the more attractive you are to them. Whereas if you're a voluntary community project and you're quite heavily grant reliant, the two things are a clash and they're not quite a fit. So that's why we set this spectrum out. So as I say, on the one hand, you've got those private structures. On the flip side, I'll jump to various sort of forms of charity and so forth. So there's companies limited by guarantee with charitable status, companies limited by guarantee with community interest company status, or just not-for-profit companies limited by guarantee. Constituted groups, which are a sort of members group with a management committee, might be different sports clubs, community groups, a kind of test pilot group to get an idea off the ground before it evolves and decides what it wants to become. Or there are, I'm still calling it a BENCOM here, but it's the charitable form of an industrial and provident society, a society for the benefit of the community, the cooperative form of the charity. And the more philanthropic, the more not-for-profit, the more you're working with vulnerable communities, the more you can demonstrate a need for charitable funds, grants and not-for-profit resources, the more you can go for them in that respect. So certainly grants are an option there, loans where you've got a business model to show how you can pay that back, and then commission contracts and crowd finance are across the board. It doesn't really, often commissioners may or may not be interested in your legal structure. And there's different commissioners that will fund different things across the spectrum. Crowd finance or what we were just talking about before, crowdsourcing, it's across the spectrum. There are platforms and ways to raise money through crowdfunding, whatever your structure or otherwise. And the fundraising, clearly, as we've mentioned, is aimed at those not-for-private profits. And in the middle here, I've kind of created a middle of the road sort of version. where, you know, as I've said, companies limited by guarantee, companies limited by guarantee KICs, co-ops and charitable incorporated organisations. There are charitable incorporated organisations that are heavily grant dependent, and that will be, you know, further to the charitable end of the spectrum. But in CIOs, there is an element, you know, of I guess remuneration or percentage of turnover that trustees can receive for being involved, which was never the case previously in original sort of charity setup. So I've shuffled them along, but knowing that it just really varies on your sort of what you're about, what your products and services are, who your beneficiaries are, who your customers are, and where you want to see your income from, which will sort of dictate whether you're looking at one end of sort of the funding spectrum landscape or the other. You know, startups, you know, it's a bit of a minefield initially to think through, you know, what do I want to be? And we run other workshops on that, but this is just to help you see in terms of where you're at now. You know, most organisations can look at fundraising unless they've not got a not-for-profit structure. Most can look at crowd finance. Most can look at commission contracts. Your philanthropic grants and loans are going to be at one end. Social investment loans, you know, they're going to want to see that you can pay it back, which is why it's not at the sort of the volunteer-led or heavily grant-dependent end. And then highlighting the fact that typically you will need to be a company limited by shares, have perhaps a slightly more private sector-looking structure in order to look at the equity options. So there are other things that people can consider, but in a nutshell, looking at this, it just gives you a feel for, you know, what you can and can't do. And then before we start to wrap up, there's lots of support out there to help people navigate thinking about their income generation strategy, thinking about how they're going to be sustainable. And what I always say is leave no stone unturned. There are local ways to get help and support. So your CVS Sector 3 here, who's you know, back these workshops, or other sort of CVSs across other areas, councils and voluntary services have access to support, training. Some have access to funds and other financial ways to help you fundraise. There's obviously local enterprise and business support. Sometimes that's provided through organisations like the Growth Company. Sometimes it's through local specialist providers and other people. But looking at that side, particularly as a social enterprise, and getting a sort of a balanced series of support can be really helpful. Different forums, there's, you know, universities, housing associations, local art networks, working out who your local public sector commissioners and individuals are that can champion this stuff. You know, it's really important to weigh up who you know, who you need to know, and what ways they might be able to champion, support, back, or invest in what you're doing. Same goes for regional. There's different organisations there. I'll jump to GMCVO first, because they're obviously partly involved in the Proper Good Fund. They have all sorts of networks, training, events, and they're managing the loan fund side of the Proper Good Fund. You've got Key Fund, who are another support provider and sort of grant loan mix provider. You've got the School for Social Entrepreneurs, who operate across the Northwest. I've put Flourish Together in there. You know, we provide support across Greater Manchester and the Northwest. And then there's other regional social enterprise support, forums, networks, and so on. Nationally, there's oodles of stuff. I won't run through all of these, but, you know, there are organisations that are sort of infrastructure support, some lobby and represent. So Social Enterprise UK represents social enterprise nationally. NCVO is the national organisation looking at the councils for voluntary organisations. There's a range of funders like Unlimited, like the Lottery, like Paul Hamlin, Esme Fairbairn. You know, there's social investments organisations like Big Society Capital, social investment business group, clearly so. There's heaps out there, and then there's some place-based, power to change. People's postcode lottery are looking at targeted areas where they can create change in different areas through the resources that they've got. And the thing that people sometimes forget about when you're setting up a social enterprise, or you've been running one for a while, or whatever, wherever you're at, you're straddling different sectors. There's a lot of cross-sector working that goes on. And so thinking about what you are, how you operate, are you a health organisation that works with young people? Are you an arts organisation that supports people with health? Are you an educational organisation that's raising awareness of the environment? Whatever you are, there's a good chance you're working across 2 or 3 sectors, and there's different funds and support available for the different sectors that are out there. And doing some research into what, in addition to local, regional and national resources and funds that are there, what's going on in your sector, both for policy information, for specialist support in that sector, or particular funds or investment that might be available to explore and utilise to help you move things along. So really all is left to say is over to you. Based on what we've talked about here, spend some time doodling this out or having a think, what are you trading in? What are you currently selling to somebody right now? Or what could you be doing? And if you don't know what you could be doing, sometimes that takes a case of looking at what is our skills and knowledge, where is our expertise, or linked to what you're doing or not. So for example, I worked with an organisation in Bolton years ago. It was a mental health support charity, but they had access to a kitchen, and they got a brilliant recipe to bake amazing cakes. And I remember buying an awful lot of loaf cakes, varying kinds, just to use and sell in different social enterprise cafes. So, they're selling products and services that directly achieve your goals, and there's having this sort of sideline because you've got the facilities and the means to do so. And so thinking about your trading options, what are you doing now? What could you be doing in future? Thinking about commissioning, what could you be doing now? What could you be working towards? What have you already perhaps piloted? And who are the stakeholders? Who's got a vested interest in your work? And how can you build relationships with different commissioners, and what sector commissioners are they? Is it health and social care? Is it criminal justice? Is it education and skills? Is it children and young people? Is it the environment? Who might need to bulk buy what you've got, or who might warm to the innovation that you are achieving and want to see that scaled up and mainstreamed in some way? And that's mapping down either the sectors or individuals or areas to explore or build relationships with. And then on the funding side, what have you applied for that's been successful or unsuccessful? What are you aware of that you need perhaps funding for? Who's going to be writing those bids? Can you do that yourself? Do you need to bring specialist expertise in? And just thinking through, what's your funding pipeline looking like, if that's something that you utilise. We do have a separate webinar called Achieving Bid Writing Success, and there are other sessions and webinars out that either we do or training sessions other CVSs run that could be helpful in that topic to build your knowledge, skills, or to help other people critique and review those bids so you're not writing them in isolation, and you're getting broader thinking to strengthen them. And fundraising wise, what have you tried? What could you try? Is it you that's doing it? Have you not got the hours in the day? Do you need people on your board, on your management committee, or some other friends of group to do that sort of work for you? Local parents, local community members, volunteers. And ultimately, what are your short-term and long-term priorities and needs? And, who do you need to be getting in contact next in order to take some ideas off the page, or to, revisit something that you might have started or tried or run out of steam with that you now need to sort of relook at in light of what you've been thinking about. So I hope that's got your income generation juices flowing. I hope there's been some new thoughts and ideas there. And as ever, you can get in touch. So you can get in touch with me or colleagues at Flourish Together through our info@flourishtogether.org.uk, or on our website. There's all sorts of tools and resources and blogs and whatnot about these sorts of topics. Sector 3 of obviously a great port of call to refer to for any of this stuff, whether you're looking at funding, social investment options, whether you're needing further assistance, anything at all. You can follow up with them or have a look at their website, which has got a funding guide. It's got other information, tools and resources, and you can get in touch with them for next steps support as well. So thanks for listening, and we will see you on the next one. Thanks ever so much.